Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited to talk about machine quilting threads with you, but somebody reminded me on the type chat right before I started that I said I would put Jessica in front of the camera for a second. We both totally forgot, but she's such a good sport. So she's gonna come say hi. This is the wind beneath my wings. She's the one that gets everything done.
Hi, everybody.
Now Nick will be happy that you're on there, right? Her husband says his only complaint about live chat is Jessica's not on here enough. But anyway, so she's the one that's behind the camera, monitoring the chat, kicking off the spammers, and bringing me your questions to answer live. So if you are watching live, go ahead and type those out, and she'll bring them to me at the end. And I do appreciate all of you that take the time to watch the live chat, whether it's on Thursday at 3 o'clock when I do it, or later on. It's just really fun to get to connect and just talk about machine quilting stuff. And last week we talked about needles, and I kind of geeked out about all the different parts of needles. I'm sure some of you were like, oh my goodness. And this week I'm going to talk about threads. Because truly, those are the two most important things to making your stitch when you're machine quilting. And so what I'm going to do today is just kind of talk about the different parts of threads, what they're made out of, what you might want to use them for. But before we even get into the presentation or the Q&A, I have to put this out there before we even start. You have to know that everything I'm sharing is mostly my opinion, right? So if I think a certain thread is great for this, just know that that's what I think. There's no right or wrong as far as that goes. It's kind of like if somebody wanted to make a quilt for the first time, what color fabric should I use, right? There's no truly right or wrong. So I hope that maybe I can pass on some tips and help you out, but don't feel like, oh, now I have to change everything I'm doing because Angela said that, because that's definitely not the case. Now, I do like to joke that I collect thread the way most quilters collect fabric. I mean, I love fabric, but I love thread. I love organizing it. I love playing with it. Here at Quilting is My Therapy, we sell every color of glide thread, which is several hundred of those. So it's just a lot of fun to talk about the different things. And when it comes to machine quilting, there's so many different types of threads that you can use. In fact, if you're newer to machine quilting, or haven't played around with a lot of threads, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, where do I even start? So this is meant to kind of help break some of that down and make it a little bit easier to understand. So without any further ado, let's get to the threads that we're going to be talking about. What I love about machine quilting is not only do you have to pick the design you're going to use, then you have to pick the kind and color of thread. And so more decisions can lead to some kind of fatigue, like decision fatigue, but this is a good thing. There's a lot of options out there and a lot of great threads, and so we're going to kind of dive into them. But if you were to take my whole presentation that I'm getting ready to give you and summarize it to one sentence, it would just be use a high quality thread. That's the most important thing. You can cut corners on a lot of things, but not your thread. Think about it. We're using this thin piece of thread to go through the quilt at a high rate of speed while we're moving the machine or the fabric in a lot of different directions. So it really has to be quality. Now, what I tell new machine quilters or my new long arm owners, if it works, it works. So if you're sitting here and you're like, but you don't understand, I use cheap thread and it works, that's great. Keep going for it. But if it's not working, it could be something with the thread. So let's kind of dive right into that. So before we get into quilted examples, let's talk about, the things to consider. And the biggest one would be the material. What is that thread made out of? You probably have stumbled along discussions online, cotton or poly, metallic or holographic. What should you use? Well, let's talk about the different aspects of all of those. Very common, cotton thread. So cotton thread is made by twisting together smaller pieces of cotton to make a beautiful machine quilting thread. And I love this idea because it's strong. Cotton is a strong fiber, of course, and when we're twisting it together, it's going to do the same. And cotton tends to have a grabbier aspect to it. It kind of grabs and makes a nice tight seam. So what I suggest this for is for people that are piecing and quilting on the same machine and they don't want to change thread. Like, I don't want to have all this different thread. I want one thread for both. That's cotton. As much as I like glide thread, which we'll talk about here in a moment, it's a little bit slicker. It doesn't make that nice tight seam that you might want for piecing. So this is going to be a great option there. Some of the downfalls of this, and this is something that people were typing about before I went live, it's really hard to tell the quality or if it's good just by looking at it. You can tell by the price. If it's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. Higher quality cotton has longer staples that make up that fiber or make up that thread. So it's going to be stronger as opposed to shorter pieces. So you really want to make sure you're buying your cotton thread from a reputable brand. So Orifil, any of the big brands that you recognize, that's going to be the way to go, and make sure it's, for piecing and quilting. There are some threads out there that are all-purpose cotton thread. If it works for you, that's great, but usually that's not going to work for you with machine quilting. Another, not downside, but thing you have to consider with cotton thread is it's going to be lintier. That's just the nature of the fiber. So if you are using a cotton thread, make sure you're cleaning out your bobbin case every once in a while. Sometimes I get too much in a rush and I forget to clean it out and it looks like I'm felting in my bobbin case. And it can be expensive. But think about cotton sheets, right? You can get cotton sheets for $10 or you can get cotton sheets for much, much more than that. It's just the feel of it. So again, it's a great quality fiber, beautiful matte finish. It's nice and strong, but there are the lint and the stuff there. So sometimes a question comes up, well, if I'm piecing cotton fabric with cotton batting, should I use cotton thread? Sure, absolutely. In fact, that was a little chat that was going on earlier, but you don't have to. You can use any type, but this would be a great option there. Now, the next type of material is Cottonesque in its look. It's a core spun poly. Basically, what's happening here is they're taking a poly and wrapping around poly around the outside of it to give it that Cottonesque look. So serger thread would be a good example of what that might look like. Omni is a great example of core spun poly. I love this because it gives you the look of cotton without the cotton price. So if you're like, oh, I want that look, that slightly threadier kind of look, this would be a good option. Another great use for this is I know a lot of quilters like to use this in their bobbins because since it does have that grabby effect, and I know grabby is not a technical cotton term, but we're going to just go with it. So it gives you that look of cotton. In the past, when I quilted for customers, sometimes I might just sneak that in there. I wouldn't say it was cotton, but I wouldn't say it wasn't cotton because it's lower lint than regular cotton. And then also it's a better price option. So if you wanted, like if you're price sensitive, you could use cotton on the top and maybe core spun poly on the bottom. Now, where we tend to get in trouble sometimes is especially like when somebody starts machine quilting and they think, ooh, I have all this serger thread laying around. I'm going to go ahead and use that. That's a perfect example of if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, then it might be the thread. Serger thread is great, very cheap. But if you think about a serged seam, it uses several cones to make that seam. It's not just one. So sometimes it's not strong enough to handle machine quilting. I used this a lot when I first started machine quilting. It was always So Fine and Omni in the bottom. I don't use this as much now, but definitely a great option. But when most people think of thread, they think of filament poly. So now we're getting into polyester. I think poly just sounds better than polyester. I'm not sure why I think that. But this was the big thing when I started long arming 21 years ago. It was like, oh my gosh, you're using poly thread, or oh my gosh. Now thread has really improved in quality and it's not such a big drama thing anymore. But poly does kind of get a bad rap in other areas. But filament poly is great because it's basically polyester threads, just like cotton, twisted together to make a longer thread. And so really this encompasses a lot of different kinds of thread. I mean, everything from Glide, which is a 40 weight poly, to So Fine, 50 weight, and then even micro quilter, 100 weight. So that filament poly can be matte, it could be shiny, it could be thin, it could be thick. It can take on a lot of different looks, but that's what makes it so flexible because it's not so much the way that thread's made, it's kind of the twist that it gets that gives it that look. This is the one I use 99% of the time. So we all know, if you've watched my live chats, I love Glide thread. That 40 weight, that sheen that you see is not because it's metallic. It's not made like a metallic thread. It's like poly, but that twist is what gives it that beautiful look. So really there's a lot of options within this category. Very strong. So I love it. Excellent elongation Sounds really fancy, doesn't it? It just means it can stretch without snapping, which is really important for machine quilting. And by the way, I should pause. I said this last week, but I get a lot of my information about threads from Superior Threads. They have a lot of great resources on their website, and so most of this has come from there. So excellent elongation is not a term I came up with, but it sounds great. But if you think about the machine quilting process, we need a thread that's going to be strong, that can handle that high rate of speed without snapping or shredding. And poly is going to give you that option. Very low lint. And that has to do with the type of fiber that it is, right? It's not cotton. So you can get away without cleaning out your bobbin case a little bit longer. But it can be not as strong. It depends on the kind you're getting. And when you start dealing with threads that are different thicknesses or thinnesses, that's not a word. You're going to have to make adjustments on that tension, and we'll talk about that when we get to the weight. So poly is a great option. It's strong. It comes in a lot of different ways, and the filament poly, where it's twisted together, gives you that look of what kind of you would imagine thread to look like. But there's also monofilament, which is one single strand, and usually we see that with clear threads, so like monopoly. There's other brands too as well. So it comes in rayon, nylon, or polyester, but from everything I've read, I've not experienced anything, but poly is the way to go. Rayon, from what I've read, again, you can tell I'm prefacing it so I don't get any hate mail. Rayon's not as color fast from what I understand. I haven't messed with it a whole lot, so I can't really speak to that from my experience. But monofilament would be an example of that one strand. And, speaking of monofilament, that's a question that comes up a lot. Do I ever use that clear thread? And I do from time to time. What's great about thread is you have your different tools that you can use. And this is an example of a quilt that I quilted. It was all hand, needle turn, applique, and this quilt was large. And there's a lot of different colors between the green and the red and the cream. So I opted to use a monofilament thread so that the quilting would just disappear. And this is what you use when you literally do not want to see any of it. And I knew with all that beautiful applique, I did not want to get into a situation where I'm accidentally quilting cream thread over the wrong color of fabric. So definitely useful there. But sometimes you want to see the quilting, right? Now, those are like the most common threads, but there are specialty threads out there, and there's even some I haven't got on here, that can really add a different look to your quilting. So next would be metallic. So remember I said glide is not a metallic thread, even though it has that sheen. It's because metallic thread is actually made from different materials and wrapped together. It looks amazing. I like to say that metallic thread is like glitter eyeliner. Not that everybody watching this is all about makeup, but it's a great pizzazz looking thing, but not something I'm going to wear every day. So it is going to be to add little bits of, pop or attention or shimmer to an area. I'm not going to probably myself use this over the whole quilt. It's going to be more like a thing I put in there. You have to adjust your tension really loose, and you have to quilt very slow. And I spelt speed wrong, very, very wrong there, but you must quilt at a slower speed. And so, because that thread, even though it's high quality, is not strong like the poly or the cotton. And I do have a couple of pictures of what that looks like on a quilt. So this was a little thread painted example. I think I did a live chat about it. But again, you can kind of see those pops of that little glint of metallic thread, but I'm not using it over the whole thing, just to add little bits of, pizzazz in there. Mostly because I don't like to quilt slowly, and if I use it over the whole quilt, I will have to quilt slow over the whole quilt. So just know that if you want to play around with it, it's going to definitely take some adjustment on your tension. And there you can see a little bit buildup of that gold thread. Isn't it pretty? But again, not something I want to do over the whole thing, but definitely a lot of fun to play with. And then lastly, glitter or mylar thread. Think of like holographic thread. If you've ever seen anybody with the little strands of glittery stuff tied in their hair, it's the same exact stuff. It's really pretty, but it's very, very, very finicky, and you have to quilt slower with it. The way this thread is put together, it's actually not twisted or a tube, kind of. It's more like flat, like toilet paper. So if you try to use this, you might find a horizontal thread attachment. A spool attachment will be helpful for that. Again, just like the metallic thread, you're going to quilt slowly, but it's going to add a really cool look to your quilts. I have, gosh, probably 10 or 11 spools of it. And I don't think I've even used like a quarter of one spool over a whole quilt, but definitely nice to have when you need it. So when you think about all of those components, the styles, the types, again, it's a personal preference. There's no right or wrong when it comes to it. And in fact, you can mix and match the materials you use on the top and bobbin. But then we also have to think about the weight of thread. So the weight just simply refers to the thickness of the thread, and that weight will determine how much the thread's going to show up, how much the quilting is going to be visible, and what needle size you're going to use. Now, there was a question in the type chat right before I went live, so I wrote it down. So talking about weight, there's no standard industry definition for thread weight. Isn't that great? So fun. That's because a 50 weight cotton thread might be slightly thicker than a 50 weight poly thread. It just has to do with the different manufacturers that make it up. So when you're looking at your needle manufacturer, and if they're saying this needle works for a 50 weight thread, just know that you might have to go up or down depending on the thread you're using. Now, the question that came up before is, what is tex weight? So I'm like, oh, I knew what that was and I can't remember. So sometimes you'll see thread that says tex 30. It's a different weight categorization. And so I actually Googled it right before I went live. And it's basically how much thread it takes to make up 100 meters. So 1,000 meters per thread, a gram of thread. It's basically has to do with the literal weight of it. But going to like just regular weight, it's how much thread, how many meters does it take to weigh 1 kilogram. So there is a equation behind the scenes for that. But for our intensive purposes and what we're using it for, we just know that a 50 weight thread is going to be a little bit thicker than a 60 weight thread. As the numbers go down, the thickness goes up. So I'm just kind of using it as a gauge. If I have glide thread that's a 40 weight, I know that So Fine, a 50 weight, is going to be a little bit thinner. So we're using that weight to determine what needle size, but it's also important because the thickness of the thread will determine how much the quilting shows. That might seem obvious, and you might be like, well, thank you for stating the obvious, Angela. But it's kind of like a pen or pencil. The thicker the tip, the more that line's going to stand out. So the reason it's important to know this is I can use a thread color that's, a little bit thinner, let's say a 60 weight. It will go over a range of colors because it's not going to show up as much. So just knowing that, oh, I have a black thread, well, a 100 weight black thread is not going to show up near as much as a 40 weight glide thread. So besides the weight, then we can also think of the finish, right? So I kind of already alluded to this. What effect do I want with my quilting? Do I want that little bit of sheen so the quilting stands out just a bit? Or do I want that matte look so that it's just kind of not, saying, hey, look at me? And honestly, when I started quilting for customers and really right up to last maybe 5 years, it would have been matte all the way. So Fine, 50 weight thread, loved it. But once I got into the shinier stuff, I really liked it. So again, it's just a total personal preference. So let's look at some quilted examples and we'll talk about the thread that I used in them. So this example, and I know it's hard to see in a picture, and so I'm going to tell you, look at this, and you'll be like on your phone or whatever, like, it looks the same to me. You'll just have to take my word for it. But in this particular example, this was a So Fine 50 weight matte poly, and you can see how it just kind of blends in to the top. It's the same thread color over all of that fabric. So if I'm working on a sampler quilt and our customer's quilt, or I really don't want the quilting to contrast in any way, that 50 weight is going to be a great option. And that matte finish means it's just going to kind of blend in. Now, not as much as like a monopoly or that monofilament thread, but definitely enough that it's not going to stand out and be like, hey, look at me. And, these pictures, even though you can see the quilting, what you're really seeing is the shadow of the quilting. So when I'm taking pictures, I'm putting the light to the side so you can see what I've done. But if you look at this in person, all you're going to see is the texture. So again, using that matte finish. Another example of when I might like to do that, this is a quilt for Tula with the black and the white. Using that, matte kind of finish just kind of keeps the quilting from taking away from her beautiful, beautiful quilt. Again, I don't think it's going to take away from the quilt if you use glide. It just depends on what preferences you're going for. Another example would be, something really detailed like this, or where the fabric is the main idea and you want the quilting to highlight those details but not draw attention away from it. So, and more examples of just that 50 weight. I like to tell newer quilters that want a rule. So it's funny, every time I teach, I have the quilters that are like, tell me the rule, tell me what to do. And I have others that are like, don't tell me what to do. You could do whatever you want. But if you're newer to machine quilting and you want a rule to follow, I suggest sticking with 40 to 50 weight thread, because it's strong enough to handle the machine quilting, but it's not going to show up too much. It's not going to be super finicky either. Once you get a little bit to those different weights, the thinner threads or even thicker threads, a little bit more finagling, and sometimes it's just better to stick with one. Another example, if I have solid fabrics and I want the quilting to just kind of try to melt into that fabric. Another example for Tula, lots of different colors here, solid, graphic design. So I pulled out the So Fine for that. Again, just a preference, but a good option, a good example of when I might use those matte threads. And you can kind of see a little bit closer up to it. Drink time. It's funny, all the quilts I've done for Tula, and this quilt probably took longer than any other quilt, just with all the starts and stops. But if you look in the different colors of fabric, the quilting isn't, screaming out at you. It just looks nice and lovely. One more example of using that matte thread. So this was one of her anchor quilts. I think I've quilted a total of maybe 4 or 5 of these, 3 for her and then some for Julie Herman. Solid fabric, lots of detail. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to use that So Fine. That's kind of where I was. That was the phase of life I was in. Oh, wait, no, that was in my So Fine era. In my thread era. I knew you'd like that one. Anyway, that thread's going to let me see that texture without overwhelming. And so you can kind of see that pretty detail right there. And it's funny because every time you make a rule, you break a rule, right? So I'm like, oh, I love how it just gives you that nice texture. Let me go back so you can see. Beautiful look. But the next time I did one for her, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do some glide. So same quilt pattern, kind of, just a different type of thread. And I know it's hard to see, but in this example, I did white glide thread. So glide, that 40 weight, it's a little bit thicker. It's going to show up a little bit more. Not so much like glitter, but definitely going to kind of give you a nice look for your money. Bang for your quilting buck. And I have an example of close up here. Now, if you had these two quilts side by side, you would definitely be able to see one would stand out just a little bit more. When your thread is thicker, when you're working with that 40 weight, you want your thread color to be more on point, whereas the thinner thread, you can get away with a little bit of playing around with that. And then I just pulled those two pictures side by side so you can kind of see. Again, I know it's hard because you can't get really up close to it, but here's a good thing. If you can't tell from that close, really, it doesn't really matter, 40 to 50 weight, shiny or not. Really, when you stand back, all you see is that beautiful quilting. And then once you get to that sheen, right, if you're like, I want the quilting to show up a little bit more, I want a little bit of that sheen, it's really going to help your quilting stand out just a bit. Again, I like the look of it, but that's something I've kind of progressed to over the years. And when you're playing with contrasting threads, which if you're newer to machine quilting, you're like, I will never play with contrasting thread color, but you never know. You might get ambitious or, think I might try some thread that contrasts a little bit on there, but it's just going to let your quilting show up just a little bit more. If you use a thicker batting, if you have a batting with a higher loft and you want to make sure the quilting doesn't just disappear, that might be another example of when I might use something with that nice sheen on it, that glide thread. Or contrasting thread and sheen, why not? Let's just do it all. So again, is every quilt you're going to quilt going to have multicolors of thread making bubbles? No. But the more you work with your threads, the more you'll find the result you get and what you prefer. And if we think about ourselves as piecing quilter, like making quilt tops, our tastes and styles change. My very first quilt that's still on my bed is Old Americana, tan, maroon, and forest green. There is nothing in my house those colors anymore. My tastes have changed a lot. So there's nothing that says you have to stay within that. So if you've only quilted with cotton the last 20 years, you can, experiment. Or if you're like, I want to stay right where I'm at, I'm happy here, that's fine too. But when you're starting out or you're learning how to machine quilt, no matter what type of thread you gravitate towards, couple things. Any reputable brand machine can run any quality thread. I get it. I remember when I started long arming, I tried bottom line because that was all the rage. Everybody wanted to use bottom line on the top. Quilting just disappeared into it, and I could not get it to run in my machine. And I would tell people, my machine doesn't like bottom line. Okay, it feels that way, but the machine can run it if I make the correct adjustments. I just didn't know what I was doing or how to get to that point. So I found 50 weight thread and I just stayed there. So if you're learning how to machine quilt and dealing with tension issues, maybe don't jump around so much early on. Find a style or a type of thread that you like that has a lot of color options, and just hang out right there while you get comfortable with the quilting process and dealing with tension and working through those things. And then once you get comfortable with it, then you can, branch out into all the other lovely specialty threads that are out there, because there are a lot, obviously, a lot of fun things you can do with it. So I know that's a quick kind of primer to kind of go over thread, and hopefully I haven't left you feeling more confused than we started. If it's a quality thread, if you like how it looks, and if it works, that's all that matters. So some good questions. Another question that came up, I kind of answered it. Do I ever use bottom line on top? So bottom line is a 60 weight poly. You can definitely use it, even though it's called bottom line. It can be used on the top. I know some quilters like to use it in the bobbin because it just, makes the bobbin last longer. You can definitely use that. Can I use Aurifil 50 weight in a sit down long arm? Yes, you can. Aurifil, if I'm going to work with cotton, that's what I use on my long arm, even my stand-up long arm. So you definitely can. I love that it's cotton, but it's strong enough that good quality will last for you. What thread is good for denim scrap quilting? Whatever you want. If you want that thicker thread to show up a little bit more in that denim, perfect. If you want it to disappear into the denim, then you can go for a thinner weight. It's, again, totally up to you. The thing about quilting on denim is it's a thicker fabric, so you might feel like, ooh, this is going to be harder, but it's actually a looser weave. So the quilting just kind of disappears into it, so it's kind of nice there. My cotton thread keeps breaking on my long arm. Would poly cotton be better to use? It depends. Come on, you knew that was going to be my answer, right? It's always it depends. If your thread is breaking on your long arm, it can be a number of things. It could be the needle's bent. It could be dull. Usually if I'm helping troubleshoot, I'd ask, where is it breaking at? Is it breaking at the needle, or is it breaking up by the check spring? And is it shredding or snapping? If it's shredding, it could be some kind of friction, like maybe this needle is too small, maybe it's rubbing, it's come out of a thread guide or something like that. If it's snapping, it could be a threading issue. I'm sorry, it could be a number of different things, but if it's a quality thread and you're using the correct size needle, maybe coming off the tension just a bit would help. That's just a guess. I am a new long armer. Congratulations. Should I start with a 40 to 50 weight poly? I think so. I think it's a great range to start with, but it's up to you. It's kind of like, which quilting design do I want to learn? Can I learn micro stippling first? Sure, absolutely. Should I? Maybe not. So it depends. But the 40 to 50 weight, like I said, it's really good range. It's strong. It can handle a lot of different stuff, and there's a lot of color options there too. Does Glide have variegated thread? They do, but I don't think it's called Glide. I think it's called something else. So variegated thread is just a thread that changes colors as you quilt. And I know some of you love it, and I do too, but I don't use it very much. But when you're looking at variegated thread, the longer the color changes, the more quality it is. That's what I read somewhere. So definitely same, like any other threads, make sure it's quality, and Glide is quality. I'm working on a picture quilt with hunting pictures with a 2-inch white sashing. Which technique would I use to quilt in the space I'm using Glide thread? So 2-inch sashing, don't you love that? It's like too small for a feather, but too big to leave unquilted. It's kind of like right in that spot. If it's a nature-inspired quilt, I think serpentine lines will look kind of fun, kind of pointy, kind of S shape, or maybe like just some wishbones. Something nice and easy, because you're not going to be able to fit anything too complex in that area. When you use metallic thread, what do you use in the bobbin? So here's the big thing, right? I can use different types of thread in the bobbin and the top. With metallic thread, I would keep the same. If I'm changing out the thread on top, I'm going to keep the same thread in the bottom. Now, if we think about how I use metallic thread, it's just in little bits and pieces here. So I'm not, quilting big sections. But if you were going to quilt a lot of a quilt with metallic thread, maybe something like cotton in the bobbin, something like a coarse spun poly, this little grabby to help hold on to it. Would I quilt further apart or closer depending on the weight of the thread? No. I might quilt over the line a couple times just to like make it stand out more if that's what I'm going for. But no, the weight doesn't determine how close or dense you should quilt it. That's up to you and the batting that you use. So no, you can play around with that and see how you like about that. And a couple questions that came up just in my mind. It wasn't asked, but I'll answer them anyway. Does thread go bad? So that was always something I didn't believe. Like, oh, it's bad thread, it's bad thread. Until one time I used a cone that I'd had forever and it kept breaking and it was bad thread. So make sure, whatever threads you like to use, that you're storing it, out of the sun. You're not storing it in the humid, garage in Missouri, and that will make it last for a long time. So it can get brittle if you're not careful. But again, I know we've covered a lot, and I don't want to make you feel like overwhelmed or like, oh, I'm more confused than when we started. Sometimes my thread selection is as deep and as complex as there's a spool right there. I'm just going to use this one. So as long as you're going with that quality thread, you'll be fine with it and you'll love it. And just like any creative endeavor, the more we work with something, whether it's piecing or quilting or applique, the more we learn what we like and don't like. And sometimes knowing what you don't like is just as important as knowing what you do like. So hopefully that's helped. Again, if you're not watching live, no worries. You can leave your questions in the comments. I get on there from time to time to answer them. Or you can always pop back in next week for my live chat next Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, where I'll share some more tension tips. I was supposed to do that this time, but we kind of ran long. So we talked about needles. We talked about thread. Now we're going to see about tension and how we make adjustments with that. So thank you so much, everybody. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and happy quilting.